Where we are going to go is we're going to switch our region of focus. We've been talking about primarily the Spanish colonization of Latin America. We're going to be focusing more on North America for today, probably over the next week. So I want you guys to kind of think about your two essential questions that you have for this unit. How did European colonization affect the indigenous populations of the Americas? And how did colonial institutions form, and what led to resistance towards these de facto governments? As we are going through this topic, I want you guys to constantly be comparing what we're seeing happen in terms of colonization in North America to Latin America to South America to Canada, which we will finish this unit off with. But these are the two primary questions. Unit. I'll remind you, it's on your Unit 2 outline. So, colonization primarily talking about England and the New World. Identifying this to you, what are we looking at here? A map, yes. Dora would be proud. What are we looking at specifically, though, here? Yes, Sharon. Yeah, primarily it looks to be like the region of which we know today to be the United States, right? Rizal, what do you got?
It's the map of like
Yeah, if we're looking at it a little bit more specifically, you guys might be using some prior knowledge to piece things together, but we're seeing regions, and I say regions specifically, regions in which indigenous populations of what we now know to be the United States resided prior to European exploration and conquest. So you kind of, you see familiar names like the Iroquois, right there in the northeastern portion of the United States. The Pawnees and the Dakota area that we know to be today, the Sioux up here, and the most local to us here in Tracy would probably be the Miwok tribe. It's not necessarily, I guess they can make the cut, but they would be kind of like right here. Oh, they're there, Miwoks, just different spelling. So we have, I want to start here with understanding of colonial period in the United States, by showing you that there were no boundaries. There are no state lines where you see the states exist. Construction of European exploration and conquest of inhabitants that had already resided in this region that we know to be the United States today. So, what initially did these colonies look like? You have up in the top right-hand corner, I guess, of this map, you have New England colonies, the middle colonies right here that resemble New York, Pennsylvania, and I guess the larger Philadelphia area. You have Virginia representing the Chesapeake Colonies, and the lower South colonies being North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. It should be noted that these colonies were established by primarily businesses or financiers in Europe, primarily England, Spain, Portugal, that kind of stuff. But they had an understanding, thank you, Christopher Columbus, of a general understanding of what this region of the world looked like, right? They had an understanding from previous explorers and conquerors of like what generally the region of the United States, modern United States, looked like. So when we see that these are kind of like divvied up in terms of like what we kind of know them to be like state lines today, they're actually more considered what is called a charter. A charter being they were given, I guess, I don't want to say necessarily pilgrims, but that's what you guys are, pilgrims. The ability to come over here, reside in a certain area, and take up a settlement within the given range of this border that the charter established to them. But what's interesting is if you look at these kind of lines in the shaded areas, they don't kind of cut off at the tail end of them. Obviously, the ocean kind of stops people from exploring into the east, but there's a specific reason why there's no borders out here. It's because the charter colonies had intended that eventually they're going to expand west. They had this understanding already that from the minute that they got to this land with the intent to colonize and settle, that they were going to expand west. This was not a thing like manifest destiny. Yes, it happened, and we'll learn about it probably in about a month or so. But it was not necessarily something that they got there and was like, oh, hey, now we should expand west. They had intended on taking over as much land to the west of the coast, to the west of the East Coast from the beginning. So primarily the charters to establish these colonies on the East Coast started at the coast and basically extended into the farther regions of the central portion of the United States today. They just did not have fixed boundaries yet, but they had intent to continue moving west. Yes. So, if you're looking at the forts that are over west, they were primarily controlled by the French, as you can kind of see up here in Quebec, Montreal, and then all the way down here to where we New Orleans-ish area. So yes, largely it was controlled by the French, but it was not necessarily like completely dominated at this point. We're still in a kind of period of time in which not only the English colonies, but also the French settlers were kind of struggling with coinciding with the indigenous populations. So that is to keep in mind that it's not like at this point it was completely controlled by European settlers. There was still kind of a struggle between who was either native to the region and should be there and who is trying to conquest it. So this is a big chart, and I want you guys to take some time to just kind of let it sink in. I'm not asking that you write every single thing down from this chart, but it is a very, very good comparison tool for you to understand the differences between the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. It's a wonderful thing that you can have in terms of this video lecture at some point on YouTube, is that you're going to be able to stop it and pause it and go back and kind of fill out maybe a chart of this for yourself. But I'm going to cover a couple of these main things here in class today. It obviously contrasts geography with government and economy, and religion and society. I'm going to tell you this right now. This is going to be very helpful when it comes to preparing for your essay exam. So, the New England colonies are primarily consist of coastal areas with good harbors. It has some inland areas with dense forests, and it has roughly poor rocky soil and short growing seasons. So the New England colonies are probably what you envision when you close your eyes and you think about Pocahontas and the arrival of new settlers into the region. You have like this kind of these harbors that ships can just easily sail into. People offload their stuff, and then they're greeted by forests
in which they start clearing out and making forts and all that kind of stuff. The stereotypical kind of English colony is the New England colonies geography. Whereas in the middle colonies, you have primarily fertile soil and long growing seasons, better for growing crops throughout the entire year, not just a certain aspect of it. And then in the southern colonies, you have a more favorable climate that is not so muggy and not so hot, and the soil is pretty good for agriculture. And as you can see at the bottom of that, it's also saying that there's wide rivers that made cities kind of unnecessary, but also really bred this kind of plantation style of crop growth. The government and economy of New England consisted of mainly small farms, lumber mills. They focused on fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. Cities started to develop along the coast, primarily, as you kind of know, with Boston and that kind of New England kind of initial city stuff. If you're an Assassin's Creed fan, I think it's Assassin's Creed 3, the best one. I actually could never play any other Assassin's Creed after that one. You know what I'm talking about in terms of what colonial harbors and cities look like. But when we get to the middle colonies, you have a lot of crop growing compared to what you see in the New England colonies, such as rye, oats, barley, potatoes, and wheat being grown as a sort of a cash crop. And then in the southern colonies, you have tobacco, rice, and indigo that are grown largely on plantations as cash crops. Religion and society up in New England, you have mainly the Puritans. That is going to be a focus of our study, probably for the next week and a half. They lived on farms. They were largely merchants and controlled trade in the area. In the middle colonies, typically you had a lot of money flowing in here. It had to do with a lot of the agricultural production. And here you see that the religious diversity was largely Catholic, Quaker, and Protestant. And then in the southern colonies, you have wealthy elite that are controlling most of the land. You have these large plantation owners. The labor supplies basically relied on indentured servants and African slaves that had been forced into migrating to what we now know the United States, and the religion of the region was primary. So, I don't want you to have all this down right now. It's not that important, but it is a fantastic comparison chart and tool for you to be using when we start getting towards an understanding of how these regions were different. So, there's a couple different types of colonies in terms of the North America. So you have a charter colony, a proprietary colony, and a royal colony. A charter colony is characterized by the governing of trade company that had been authorized by the English crown. So the English crown had basically said, okay, we approve you going over to quote unquote this new land and taking up settlement, and you're going to go out and get us some resources. You're going to basically establish a colony, make it profitable, and kick us back some money. Most recognizable by the high degree of independence that the settled under a charter colony were privileged to have. So this is the quote unquote stereotypical colony that is meant to be that the founders of our country embody the spirit of maintaining this independence, having control over themselves, but primarily they were authorized by the English crown. Proprietary colony, on the other hand, was also authorized by the English crown. However, the crown appointed proprietors to govern the colony. Because of this appointment, they experienced less independence than a charter, and the term proprietary is the type of ownership, so it had less independence than a charter colony because it was kind of not necessarily being directly ruled by the crown, but it was basically being controlled by an agent of the crown. And in a royal colony, it was controlled directly by the crown, giving those subjects the least degree of independence of all the colonies. The crown made all appointments directly, leaving those appointed to favor of the king, and thus acted in the king's behalf rather than the settlers. So we're thinking about independence in terms of all three of these colonies. You have the charter colony experiencing the most independence. You have a proprietary colony that experienced some independence but was still kind of under control of the British Crown. And then the royal colony that was generally controlled. Most of their day-to-day affairs were controlled by the crown. And if we're defining what a colony is up at the top, it's a colony is a country or area under the full or partial political control of another country. Definition. Again, I don't need you to have all of this written down, just a quick understanding of which three of these kind of embody. So, let's talk about social change in England and why or what those reasons were to move to. So, social change in England was primarily the motivating factor for many groups to kind of migrate to North America. And we see this social gap between the rich and the poor widening as a result of the Industrial Revolution that you should kind of pop into your brain from your world history classes last year, is that you have a growing kind of separation between the haves and the have-nots, the big industrial bosses maintaining a lot of the wealth within a country, whereas the lower class or the middle class workers that are primarily just working for a wage are being paid very little to maximize profits for whatever business they were working in. And a lot of this is kind of sparking a lot of rapid growth of these colonial charters in North America. Wood primarily is also a commodity that became essentially more precious than gold because of this newfound industrialization, trying to produce more infrastructure. Wood actually becomes quite a necessary material, more so than in the past. And the modern day United States has quite a bit of it being non-industrialized before. You have the English Reformation that also influences this kind of move towards or migration towards North America. And then you also have joint stock companies, which was a portion of a company owned by shareholders that have a say in the company's direction, had kind of said, hey, there's a lot of untapped potential over here in this region of the world. We should probably be taking some portion of that. So these joint stock companies, basically the shareholders said, hey, in a business interest, we should probably go and move to North America to try and maximize our profits, to exercise these business ventures such as growing cash crops and also religious autonomy. All were factors that led to these people trying to migrate. You didn't have to bring a whole bunch of industrial equipment to harvest it. It was not necessarily like a big operation, like you'd have to go in and set up like a mine to extract gold or silver or anything like that. The harvesting of wood is pretty easy, and that makes the profitability of the harvesting of this material a lot more profitable and quick. What are the initial populations? It varied from region to region, and it varied from country to country in terms of like English or French relations, and we'll see that with our comparison between North America being the English colonies and the French colonies as well. But it varied from region to region. In New England, primarily decent relations were established with the natives. The natives taught the early settlers how to grow food and new agricultural techniques, and they kind of worked as trade partners. And you kind of might remember this from the crash course, most recent crash course video that I had you guys watch. It's that we have this understanding, this stereotypical understanding that, especially with the first Thanksgiving, right, that the English settlers were dying off. They did not know how to really survive in this region of the world, and they kind of got helped out. What is it? Squanto, in the story, primarily was the kind of bridging force between the indigenous population and the English settlers. That basically they swapped the goods that English colonial people had for, like, that's how they survived. But primarily, working as trade partners is not necessarily a myth, nor is it something that didn't happen, but they both saw they could gain something from friendship or some sort of relationship with the indigenous population and English settlers. So trade was primarily the relations. But as we start to see more colonialization happen and more established English kind of culture, you start to see that these white immigrants start to educate and Christianize populations. And you also see attempts for forced assimilation like we saw in Latin and South America. But as time drew on, tensions start to rise. And this increased tensions, especially as primarily the Puritans started to consume more and more land with each passing year, establishing their colonies. Which leads us to a term that is on your unit to outline, that is 1637, where hostilities between the English colonials and the Peco indigenous tribe in the Connecticut Valley increased over land rights. Relatively little conversation took place between these two groups, and the driving focus of England was to settle here, not to basically trade here. They had the intent to move west. Remember, this idea of manifest destiny does eventually come in as a justification tool later on, but it was completely these charter colonies' intent to expand. Which brings us to our first case study for this region, and trust me, I'm almost done. King Philip's War, and it began in June of 1675. Who was part of the Wampanoag Nation, led an attack on an English settlement in the inlands of Massachusetts. And over the next year, Native Americans attacked more than half of New England's towns, killing 5% of New England's colonists. Native American casualties in New England were higher, perhaps roughly around 40% were killed by colonists or forced to flee as a result of colonial attacks. And the English kind of coined this conflict as King Philip's War. Flash forward about a year or so to 1676, then mutilated his body and publicly displayed it for everybody to see. Shortly after, Native American defenses collapsed. Colonists sold many surviving natives into slavery in the West Indies and enslaved many more women and children into New England as kind of like this response to this hostility the year prior. So this is moving forward into analysis of King Philip's War, which brings us kind of again to this understanding of where we're going to be at. That is kind of right here in this Massachusetts area, and that is going to be the focus for us. This is an interesting map, though, and circa 1600 to circa 1650, you have native settlements and trails throughout this region that King Philip's War is kind of taking place on. And you just see the diversity and kind of the complexity of the interconnectivity between tribes throughout the region. It's not like it was just one whole kind of community here. There was many different communities and many different tribes throughout the region. And as I had kind of mentioned before, a big driving force between a lot of these conflicts is that they were not necessarily here to stop wherever that colonial charter kind of initially gave them rights to land, is that they planned on expanding as far as possible, which naturally is going to create more and more conflict as they start to push indigenous populations into other indigenous populations. So, just for your understanding, this is a picture of Metacommet, an illustration from 1772. It's kind of a representative image of the hostilities, portion of the hostilities from 1883. And primarily what you guys are going to be focusing on for the rest of today and primarily tomorrow is reading through some sources to identify what it was going to be primarily the hostility between the expansion of land to the west, but there's more to the story than that. So what I'm going to ask that you guys do over the course of the rest of today's period is just initially kind of scan through some documents that I'm going to give you guys, and then tomorrow you guys are going to work as a group to come to an understanding of this central historical question. So with that, go ahead and kind of take maybe a minute or two, maybe 5, to give yourself a quick summary of what we have just talked about in terms of the introduction to English colonial society.